Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome to United Lodge of Theosophists, San Diego, to the Aquarian series. And tonight, the title of the presentation is The Platonic Quest. And that will be given to us by our own Jonathan Colbert. To start off, a reading from the Bhagavad Gita. Seek this wisdom by doing service, by strong search, by questions, and by humility. The wise who see the truth will communicate it unto thee, and knowing which thou shalt never again fall into error, O son of Bharata. By this knowledge, thou shalt see all things and creatures whatsoever in thyself, and then in me. Even if thou wert the greatest of all sinners, thou shalt be able to cross over all sins in the bark of spiritual knowledge. As the natural fire, O Arjuna, reduceth fuel to ashes, so does the fire of knowledge reduce all actions to ashes. There is no purifier in this world to be compared to spiritual knowledge. And he who is perfected in devotion findeth spiritual knowledge springing up spontaneously in himself in the progress of time. And with that, our own Jonathan Colbert.
Well, thank you, Monica, for the lovely reading and the announcements. So it is a privilege to be here and to speak before you. And today we'll be thinking about the Platonic Quest. And it occurs to this student that the Platonic Quest is precisely what was read about in the Bhagavad Gita, seeking this wisdom. How do you do it? It says 4 ways: service, humility, questions, strong search. Not in that order, but you get the idea. And theosophy, it is said, is a synthesis of religion, science, and philosophy. And this is a very ancient idea that all 3 could be together. It's only in modern times that everything's kind of parsed out and separated. But this is a very ancient teaching that when you really get to the true essence of any of these 3, you're getting to the essence of the other 2. And it has been called in modern times the religion of responsibility, the science of spirituality, and the philosophy of perfectibility, which is different than the philosophy of perfectionism. And we all fall into that trap. We have to be perfect or something. The perfectibility that theosophy is looking at is something that is cultivated over thousands of lifetimes, over millions of years. So this is the radical and revolutionary premise and basis on which the theosophy is pointing to the very depths of what is possible to unfold in the so-called obligatory pilgrimage of humanity. So, with reference to Plato, obviously this presentation will be on philosophy because he is considered to be, by many philosophers, including Alfred North Whitehead, to be really the basis of Western philosophy, and that all philosophical statements since Plato have been really just footnotes to Plato. So it behooves a person who is interested in philosophy to know a little bit about Plato. And this student is not going to give you much of an academic version because he's not capable of that. But we'll just say a few things that we picked up in the dialogues. And it'll be more by way of introduction. And we'll show you a couple of diagrams, because Plato himself said that if you take a person to a diagram, you can prove that all learning is actually recollection. He was a reincarnationist. And he had the idea that there's something about a diagram, and in the East they would call it a yantra, that has an awakening power of previous initiations or previous experiences of the soul. And then after we look at a few diagrams, we will hear a short telling of one of Plato's stories that comes from the Republic, and it will be a telling of the myth of by another student. And so Plato was very, very much influenced by a man named Socrates, as we know. When he was young, his teacher was Socrates. Socrates, you could say, was his mentor. And it wasn't a shallow reverence that that Plato had for Socrates. Because the way that Socrates lived, he lived by example. And it's sui generis, it can't be repeated. We can all do something of his life in our lives. But what was so moving for Plato was his absolute fidelity to truth, way past any kind of a concept of survival, okay? He was more onto truth than he was onto the preservation of his own life. He was absolutely fearless. And he had such a love for his fellow Athenians that he would talk to people. He was not an armchair philosopher. He was very engaged, and he very much liked the young people. And he would ask them questions, and he would engage them, and he would challenge their thinking, and he would challenge especially their assumptions. And so there was actually quite a few of these people that turned against him in the process. So he was equally loved and equally hated, okay? Because he was loved by those who were moved, like Plato was, by his fearlessness and by his integrity, and his banter and his availability, really. But he was hated by those who he really challenged. And there was a growing consensus that something had to be done about this guy. So he was told that he would have to be put to death, and his crime was for corrupting the youth. So, and that was probably an accusation by elders, because he was challenging their control. So you can see that times have not changed much. That there's kind of that people walk around in this kind of fog. Some people would say a coma of not asking questions about what it means to live. And there was the idea that the unexamined life is actually not really worth living. And in the trial of Socrates, which is very famous, it's depicted in 4 of the different dialogues, very prominently of which is the Apology. he's making the case that the priestess of Delphi said that actually Socrates was the wisest man on earth. And Socrates wanted to really challenge that. That couldn't be true. On what basis? I don't understand what you're saying. But on the other hand, she's the oracle, or he's the oracle of Delphi. So that's a god. And so he was almost in a dilemma because he knows he's not the wisest man. He just knows. But this God is saying he is. And so then he tells the story that he went out and about and tried to find somebody who was wiser than he was. So he would find people who were good at oratory, and he would find something where they were good at their craft, but they were really kind of lacking, kind of shallow. They could be in the arts, they could be in oratory, they could even be in the crafts, in the any kind of a craftsmanship kind of thing. They could be politicians. And he kept realizing that actually there was just something lacking and something missing. And because what Socrates figured out was that really they had the shortcoming of actually a double kind of ignorance. That there's a single ignorance when you don't know, but there's a double ignorance of when you don't know that you don't know. And that's when a person on the Platonic Quest is going to find very much difficulty in getting any kind of traction. But once a person uncovers within themselves the humility to know that you don't know, and that takes a position of actually an agnostic position, then the sky is the limit of what you can learn. It's all different. The whole ceiling of limitation is just removed, and you've got the whole sky and the whole universe to begin learning at that point. You can get some real traction, and you can build up knowledge in order to be able to help and serve others. It becomes possible at that point. So Plato, using the device of dialogue to present his ideas, kind of pioneered a whole art form, really. And it's called dialogue, it's called dialectic, it's called call and response, you could say, like there is in music and poetry. Even in the human brain, they're finding out different parts of the human brain do call and response to different other parts of the brain, for example. So it's kind of a natural organic breathing. This idea of question and answer, engaging others back and forth. And Theosophy has actually implemented that method through HPB's The Key to Theosophy. That's the way it is in the Bhagavad Gita that we read from just now, where that's really a sacred colloquy, it's called. A soliloquy is right when one person gives a speech, right? But a colloquy, apparently, is when there's two people, and there's kind of a Q&A thing going on. And Arjuna is asking Krishna questions. And it's a whole exercise where Krishna is helping Arjuna get over his despondency, really. And it's a method of getting out of the doldrums, you could say, of inertia. And this idea of this call and response, as we're saying, and this sacred colloquy between the holy Krishna and Arjuna in that context. So he uses these dialogues, and several of them are about the trial of Socrates and so forth. And it is said that the earlier dialogues are thought to be like a true representation of, or a closest representation of how Socrates really was. And that the more Plato developed, the more Plato developed his teachings, really. He used Socrates as kind of a mouthpiece to unfold those teachings. One of Plato's another method besides the dialogues are the use of analogy and correspondence, metaphor, simile, and he called it something called the dialectic. And matter of fact, in the Almanac, there is a quote from the Republic, from Plato, and where Plato, through Socrates, says dialectic and dialectic alone goes directly to the first principle and is the only science, so he's calling it a science, which does away with hypothesis in order to make her ground secure. The eye of the soul, which is literally buried in an outlandish slough, is by her gentle aid, the dialectic, lifted upwards. And she uses as handmaids and helpers in the work of conversation, the sciences. So the sciences are actually deployed as analogy and correspondence. And that's why we're so lucky to have Ken here, because he's so good at unpacking these scientific analogies and helping us understand that. And so that the science becomes rich with suggestive inferences and of pointing in the direction of the mysteries. And the difference between science and the dialectic, really, and philosophy, you could even say, is that science observes X, Y, and Z in nature and looks for a through line and calls that a hypothesis, right? The dialectic, the divine dialectic, starts off with propositions, okay? So what's the difference between a hypothesis and a proposition? There's a lot of overlap, obviously, because both are said to be, well, we don't know, but this is something to consider, right? But the difference we understand is that one is deductive and the other is inductive. That the idea of a hypothesis is inductive. So you're going from particulars to universals. Whereas the idea of a proposition is you're examining universal ideas, universal truths, and then finding examples of how they manifest. So then the problem occurs that one may ask, well, how do you know what's universal, right? And your opinion, you think your opinion is universal, and I think my opinion is universal. How could that be? And so what are you going to do? And is this process of looking at what you think is universal, your whole exercise in philosophy, if that's the case, is going to be you spinning out your own spider web of what you think is true. And then I'll be doing the same thing, and how are we going to get anywhere with that, right? Well, Plato is kind of examining this in the 6th book of the Republic. And he's looking for a way to think of these archetypes, because he's got this idea that these ideal forms, that idea that ideas rule the world, that comes from Plato and Socrates. But what are these ideas? They are, and this is why it's of particular interest in theosophy, these abstract universal ideas. And you can tell that the way Plato does it is he says that there's this formless world of, interestingly enough, he calls it Plato's, they're called in philosophy Plato's forms. But these forms are very abstract. And according to Plato, they issue forth from a reality that's more real than the senses can deliver. So, and that's kind of the idea of Socrates and the idea of awakening the intuition, which he does with analogy and correspondence. And theosophically, we would call it the awakening of buddhi. And that analogy and correspondence have everything to do with the awakening of buddhi. And Plato uses metaphor and so forth. He uses a metaphor, for example, of what is the soul. He uses the analogy of a charioteer and two horses. And one horse is nice and tame and does what it's supposed to do. The other one's wild and wants to go here and wants to go there. But interestingly enough, the wild one is the stronger one. So if the charioteer can kind of train the nicer horse, somehow that attunes the wild horse. And so there's a whole psychology in that, a meta psychology in that. And a technique, actually a hint about how we can function, because we all have these parts within our nature. He uses other analogies like the cave. We'll talk about the cave in a minute. Plato's cave, right? And he uses the analogy of the divided line, for example. So back to book 6. What do you do about opinions? How do you start doing philosophy? How do you sift through these opinions? Well, he's talking about, okay, different people have different eyes and different instruments. So your eye's like this, another person's eye's like that, and so forth. But really, the defining characteristic of what helps us to see the nature of something is not so much how good our eyes are. I mean, if we can see reasonably well, but how much light there is, right? So light becomes the symbol of this archetypal world. And so the sun is like in theosophy or in the ancient East, they would say the invisible sun, right? But the sun becomes a representative, or at least a really strong natural symbol for that which illumines everything. So and that's kind of this archetypal realm that he wants to talk about. And then he says, let's divide up everything into 4. So, and let's make a line between that which is visible to the senses and that which is apprehendable to the intelligence. And there's the intelligible world and the visible world. And the visible world, you can divide it up into the shadows that you see, like the shadow behind the desk or the chair, or like an image in water, the reflection in the mirror. That's like the world of images. Then you have the world of actual objects, lodges, chairs, rivers, forests, other people, so forth. And see, that's the world of the senses. So even there, one is relatively more real than the other, right? Because the objects are more real than the shadows. Then there's a divided line, like a horizontal divided line, kind of separating the intelligible world from the physical, from the senses, world of the senses. And the 2 higher ones there, and that can be subdivided to the realm of intellect, where you start noticing patterns, and he uses geometry and mathematics as an excellent example of that, because you're getting beyond the realm of opinion at that point. everybody's mind can tie in with this idea of mathematics. There's something innate within the soul that starts to resonate to mathematics. So it's a kind of a universal language, you could say. And it has to do with the realm of thought and the realm of ideas. But it's not these formless ideas. So it's the realm of principles. You can think things through based on principles. And this thinking things through is called dianoia. But it's still the realm of the mind, and it's beyond the realm of the senses. So that's why it's above that divided line. And then above that is this archetypal world. It's the realm of pure good, the agathon. And that's the idea that there's such thing as universal good that is really hard to imagine because it's something that is universally good for all beings. So you could call it universal love. You could call it universal brotherhood. You could call it maybe the first proposition of the secret doctrine. But see, these are all the way HPV does that in the secret doctrine. She calls them all propositions, doesn't she?
Yeah.
She doesn't say this is the truth. She says think about these things. So you have the absolute, boundless, eternal, immutable principle about which nothing really can be said, according to the Mundaka Upanishad. It can't even really be thought. It's transcendent. And so a word for it would be the absolute. But even though it's abstract, and all these ideas are abstract, like anything in the three fundamental propositions of the secret doctrine, they're very abstract. They shed a light. You can tell something about the light by looking at the lit, and seeing what kind of perspective that it offers, and so forth. So that's the way he does his analogy of the divided line. Then in book 7, he talks about the allegory of the cave. And he says, this is what you could do. You could think of it like this. That in this world of illusion and opinions and fantasy and images, imagine some people that are chained in a cave, pretty dark in there. And they're chained, let's say, sitting down maybe, but they're shackled in such a way that they can't move their faces. They can only look ahead, and they can't really get up. But there's stuff going on. Why? Because there's a wall behind them, and behind the wall, in the back of the cave, there's a fire. There's no sunshine, it's a cave, right? But there is fire. And between the fire and this wall, which is maybe this high, there's these marionette people walking around back there. And they're holding up these images of nature, images of trees, images of horses, images of other people. I mean, so these people are sitting there and they're looking up on this wall and they're looking at all these shadows. There's nothing but shadows and echoes in this cave. And it's all illusion. And the people, there's such thing as getting really good at figuring out all the shadows and comparing one shadow to the other. And it's really hard to imagine if that's all you've seen, that the whole thing is an illusion and that there's this huge world outside. And then there's the idea that one of them is unshackled and brought out to the top of the cave and, outside in the sunshine. And it's very, very difficult for that person to stand up, to maintain balance, to use their leg muscles, to climb all the way up there and have balance and struggle and get up out of the mouth of this cave and into the sunlight. You can imagine how brilliant the sunlight would look after a lifetime in that. And just and then finally getting acclimated to it and looking around and looking at all these objects and everything like that. And it's just so different and so much more vivid and relatively more real. And that's the idea of coming out into, from the students' understanding, of getting into the world of thought, and then the sun really becomes, at that point, becomes like the archetypes, the agathon. So now I'm going to try an experiment. This is one of those what could possibly go wrong experiments. And so I'm going to show you a couple of these diagrams here. So we're going to do that. Drum roll.
It picked up.
Well, so far nothing's happening. Oh yeah, it's thinking about it. All right. Something's happening. If we're not careful, this might work out. Okay. So I'm going to do something. Stop share. Too bad I didn't set up my computer. Now I'm going to have to pull up my PowerPoint. Okay, and then we're going to do here, pull up this. Here. And we go into play. This is what Maria does. She has to edit this stuff out.
I think you have to share.
Am I not sharing? Okay. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. Share a screen. Here. And then I have to move this a little bit. Huh.
Usually one of those four symbols will move the grid of people.
How do I get rid of this thing? Maybe I just do that. There we go.
Yeah, then you can move it around.
I had to uncover the play thing.
Play button, yeah.
All right. So I'm going to show you a few diagrams. So this is the divided line. If you go on the internet and you look for, an image of in Google Images for the divided line, there's hundreds of them on the internet. This is a well thought through subject. And as we said before, in this case, where the line C is, that would be the divided line in this case. And it's a very rudimentary diagram, and I'm going to show you one that's a lot more involved in a second. But you have Icasia, which is the realm of the imaginary realm, the realm of fantasy. Pistis, which is a realm of belief. And in this context, it has to do with our opinions. And then you have the divided line, and then you have Dianoia, which is the realm of thought. And then you have the realm of noesis, which is able to apprehend the archetypes. And I would point out that these archetypes are different. The Platonic archetypes are different than a lot of things that we call archetypal now. For example, Jungian archetypes, there's 12 personality archetypes. The ruler, the seeker, the lover, there's all these different archetypes, and it's a lot of fun to take a look at, I'm like this, you're like that, and all that stuff. But this idea of archetypes is actually much more abstract than that. And they have to do with universal ideas, and transcendent universal ideas, which in turn throw light philosophically on so much of all of nature, including psychology. So it doesn't, philosophy can throw light on psychology, but they're different. Philosophy has to do with precision in thought and the purity of thought and so forth. Whereas psychology has to do with honesty within a circumstance and with terms of your feelings, in terms of identity and so forth and so forth. But these philosophical archetypes in turn do shine light on lower archetypes, for example. All right, let me mess with another one here. Okay, here's another diagram, and this can be found in Parapolitics by Professor Raghavan Iyer. And what he does with this, you can see some different things going on here. I guess I can't do the cursor, so I'll just explain it. So you have the divided line. See there in the middle? So this time it's vertical, and that's on purpose. In other words, it shows a vertical dimension and therefore a vertical mobility. That's what the dialectic is the magic of the dialectic. And this dialectic is something that we all have within our capability, provided we're able to tell the difference between the knower and the field, like in the Bhagavad Gita. Mm-hmm. Because then you can say, okay, I'm not at this level, or am I not at that level? And that's the mobility and so forth. Or one can temporarily identify with a level and make use of it. Like, for example, I could temporarily identify with the realm of imagining, and I could create the myth of Ur. Not me, but a genius like Plato could, for example. You see, it's going into the realm of mythology and fiction and so forth to deliver a teaching. The realm of opinion is the same way. I could write for a newspaper, a column in the newspaper, in the opinion section. And maybe it's possible to deliver some real, something of import in that section, for example. But then above the divided line, you have dianoia, which is called thinking, and it's also illustrated by Mathematica. So it's the realm of mathematics and abstract principles. But this is still different than the realm of pure vision, which is the archetypal realm. And then above all that, you have the agathon. Now, this is something that we're not going to try and do much with this. This is the famous theosophical diagram on page 200 of the Secret Doctrine. But the only thing that I wanted to point out here was you have these three higher planes that are abstract and formless, okay? And then you have all of these, the first plane, second plane, third plane, fourth plane, which are relatively have form. This archetypal world that's in the realm of form is not the formless archetypal realm of Plato. And HPB has a footnote at the bottom of this diagram that says that. The archetypal realm, she says it, I forgot how it's exactly done, but it's like, this archetypal realm does not reflect the divine ideas coming from the mind of deity. So really this higher realm is a realm of universal mind. So that's the realm of the archetypes. What is universal mind? Well, from one perspective, it is the collectivity of all minds. From another perspective, it is the mind of the universe. And if the mind could speak to each one of us, this universal mind, it would say, you are me at your point. So, that's part of the Platonic quest, is the seeking of the ability to think more universally. And it tends to etherealize how we think of time, space, and motion by learning to think universally. And it's something that's difficult at first. It's blinding to the eyes at first. You can't see the orientation at first. And I keep saying at first, all of humanity is like that. Okay, so I'm not trying to say that, but on the other hand, there are relative levels of wisdom and knowledge that can be learned. And there are great beings who have been on this Platonic quest for lifetimes and lifetimes, who, through their own humility, have been able to get traction, and have been able to learn what they know and what they don't know. And they become beings like Socrates, who have really learned that they don't know. But that isn't to say that there isn't wisdom and that there are not knowers of that wisdom. But it's all relative. And it's degrees of universality. So here's the diagram of the cave. You can see the people. If I had my little rubber, my cursor, see how they're, I think I could do that. But Jay, could you aim the camera over at me, if you don't mind? I'm going to walk over here and do something that I might regret. Okay. So you have the people who are chained down, and they can only look at this wall. Then you have this wall, and then you have these kind of ominous looking controller figures. I don't know who they are, but they're holding these images. And then there's a fire. And so you can see why there would be the fire going here, and then the light getting interrupted by these, in the form of the shadows. But this would be the whole, you can imagine this would be the whole reality. And then finally, you can, this guy, see how he's struggling? And this person here has got to figure out how to get from here to here. It's a struggle. It's an uphill climb. It's not easy. And that's the idea of the Platonic quest. It isn't easy. But it's rewarding. And the reward is this guy gets to see so much more, Let me see if there's any other diagrams here. Oh, I just wanted to, let me see if I have any more. Oh, I just now kicked myself out. But I'll just read this one more time, this quote from Plato. He says, dialectic and dialectic alone goes directly to the first principle and is the only science which does away with hypothesis in order to make her ground secure. The eye of the soul, which is literally buried in an outlandish slough, is by her gentle aid lifted upward, as she uses as handmaids and helpers in the work of conversation, the sciences. So I'm going to unshare my screen. And I think I'll just do that. All right. That's kind of the end of what I was going to say. I had spoken with Jim Tupfer. Are you available to tell the story of the myth of Ur?
Yes, I am, John.
Well, thank you for doing that.
Okay. You want me to do it now?
Yes, please.
Yes, okay. Well, the myth of Ur occurs in the very last chapter of Plato's magnificent work, The Republic, which is really a question and exploration by people who are sincerely committed to truth and understanding it. They wanted to know what the nature of justice really is. So the whole entire dialogue is an exploration through definition and then rejection and refinement of concepts, refinement of meaning, until they can arrive at some understanding of justice and recognize that wisdom is essential to the whole realization and actualization of justice in the world. At the end of the Republic, Plato has discussed and revealed the harmonic nature of justice and how the human being it has to do with nous, or reason in this original sense that Plato uses it, that is capable of grasping the archetypes that you were pointing to, Jonathan, which themselves reveal the meaning of justice and purity and good and so forth. So now what Plato then establishes at the end of the Republic is, in fact, that the soul, nous, is the quintessential faculty of the soul, and it's immortal. When it comes together with the body, it then is affected by the passions and the appetites that the body has. And nous then becomes not only something that apprehends the archetypes, but it also regulates the passions and the appetites. Because it's necessary to be in a mortal body. You have to deal with what is natural to the mortal body, which is passions, appetites, desires, etc. But at any rate, he's establishing then what he does is tries to establish the fact that the soul of man is fundamentally immortal. And beyond that, he establishes that it is born again and again and again. That's why he says you can see someone in life who's a very fine, very just human being to all considerations. He has a tremendous impartiality. He has a tremendous perspective. He's integrated as a human being. He's able to affect others in a positive way, to bring harmony, concord, cooperation, understanding, and a sense of your own role and responsibilities. So even though that might be true, that kind of individual often have tragedy in their life. Why? How do you understand it? Well, because the universe is really a moral order. And that means that this individual did something in previous lives that came to fruition in that life, even though he was acting very, very ethically and very in terms of being very just in relation to all the people he interacted with. So you have to be able to account for the just person suffering what seems to be tragedy or accident or whatever, but it's really connected with choices made in previous incarnations. So then he goes on to tell the myth of which gives us some intimation it's kind of a Buddhic intimation of the fact that there are after-death states and that beings are born again. And why is it we forget so much? So this is where he then tells the myth of in the myth, Er, is a warrior. He's killed in battle. He lies in readiness to be burned, his body to be burned on the funeral pyre for 10 days. They put him on the funeral pyre. He wakes up to the astonishment of all those who provide that function. And he says, I'm waking up because I really was not dead. I was allowed to go into the other world and was told I was going to be a witness to what happens to souls after they die. And then I'm to come back and report it to mankind. And so what he does is he shows how justice and injustice, good and evil, do have a bearing on human well-being and happiness. And they are causes that have to be worked out over time and removing of ignorance. So in the myth, says, I was taken to a meadow, and in that meadow, in the middle of the meadow, were judges. On one side of the judges were two apertures. One ascended into the heavens, and the second descended into earth. On the other side of the judges was an aperture coming from the heavens to earth, and from earth underneath to earth on top. And he said, what I discovered was that the judges would take every soul and then determine that this person was going to go upward into the celestial regions or downward into the bowels of the earth and Tartarus. And on the other side, they would emerge at some point. Those would descend from heaven, others would come up from the bowels of hell. Now, he said, what he discovered is that those that came down from the skies, from the heavens, were talking about the incredible joys, the marvelous beauty and majesty of being in the celestial regions. Those that came from below the earth and were finally able to get back out and unto the meadow, and from their 1,000 years of being underneath the earth, they told of incredible suffering and misery, and they commiserated with each other, and they were so grateful to get out of that condition. And then they refer to the fact that they were startled to find that just before they were able to come from hell back up to earth, that there was a voice that would come and prevent certain souls who'd done a great deal of evil from ever being able to get out. And so they had to be remaining there. So he saw this, and then he said, a guide took he, and those who came out from the earth and those who came down from the heavens, and took them across a track for a period of time. And then they came to another meadow. When they were in that meadow, they were all seated, and out came someone called the interpreter. The interpreter spoke to them, and he pointed to a spindle, the spindle of necessity from the heavens to earth, in which there were goddesses of the past, the present, and the future, 3 goddesses in particular. The interpreter addressed all the souls that had just either come from heaven or come from Tartarus, and they were sitting on these plains. He says, I'm going to explain something to you, and I want you to listen carefully. You're going to be given lots, where you're number 1, you're number 1,000, you're number whatever. I'm also going to put out on the ground before you patterns of a life to come. And there are going to be many more patterns than there are souls to choose. So even if you're last, you'll still have choices that are meaningful. And for those of you who are at the beginning, I warn you to be cautious. Be careful. Take your time. Select your pattern of life carefully. When you've chosen your pattern, you will go by the 3 goddesses, and they will eventually sew it onto you. And so that will be what you have chosen. Heaven is blameless. We get what we choose. So having said this, the interpreter moved away and called out the lot numbers. And the first one who came up was thrilled that he was the first of the lot. And so he looked at all the patterns, and he was looking right away for what? It was someone who came from the heavenly regions, but he was looking for power. And so he found quickly the life of a despot, and he picked it up and said, I've made my choice. And the interpreter said, fine, now go ahead to the dot, and they will they will sew it onto you. But as the second person was getting ready to choose his lot, they suddenly heard a grieving, groaning voice. And they looked and they saw the first one who chose. And he was looking at his pattern with greater clarity and focus. And when he did, he saw, yes, he was a despot. He had tremendous power and wealth, but he was doomed to eat his own children. And this was just horrendous. And he wept, but he could not change his pattern. That became a signal, a warning signal to everyone else. But still, says what I noticed was that so many people chose things to do with the passions that came from heaven. Why? Because in their previous life, they had been living a very decent life, but not a very self-aware life. And so they were good out of habit. They weren't really aware and consciously choosing when it was difficult to choose the good. It was easy for them. And they had no awareness they had no self-awareness of the passions, the desires, consequences that flowed. And so many of them made very bad choices. And others who had suffered a lot, they were exercising greater care. And you had the great Odysseus, who was the last one to choose. Well, he only chose last not because he was last, but he chose last because he took his time. He said, I don't care if I'd been the first one to receive the lot, I'd been the first in the lottery. I would have taken time because I want a simple life. And I don't want all this power and glory and this and that. No, I want a simple life so I can think. And so all the choices were made. Then all the souls were taken on a 10-day trek through an arid desert in which there was tremendous thirst. And so finally they get to the desert of Lethe, and next to it is flowing the river of unmindfulness. And so they spend the night and they're told, now you're going to drink. Everyone has to drink from the river of unmindfulness. But the more you drink, the less you'll remember. The thread will not carry through in a conscious way. And so many drank a lot. Some drank little because they had self-restraint, because they'd suffered a lot. And said, what I notice is people rotate from life to life. One life is good, the next life is bad. They make good choices and bad choices, oscillating back and forth, depending on their remembrance of immediate past experience. But the greatest ones are those who learn from their experience and wake up quickly. So I was told to mention, beware. Justice is in every stage of life, death, afterlife, and again. The universe is not deceived. So a just man must always strive to be just and wise. And that's why wisdom is so important, because wisdom is what helps us to see those actions that are right and honorable and are concordant with the universe of harmony. So that's his story of the myth of Earth.
Thank you very much, Jim. Very much. Excellent. And very instructive. And it's an example of Plato's storytelling and power to build an analogy, but it's really very much at least according to the key to theosophy, it's pretty close to what really happens. So that's like the ultimate NDE that he had, right? Near-death experience. But it's very instructive. Now, there are many people here who are capable of answering questions much better than I am, including the person who told the story of the myth of Ur. But I can see about 10 other people who would be very capable. So, Judy, I see your hand is up.
But is there a question to answer before I say what I'd like to say? I was away for a few minutes.
Okay, do you want somebody else to kind of do something and then you want to come in a little later?
Yeah, during Jim's talk, I was away for a few minutes and then I heard most of it. So thanks to both of you. So I have something that might change the dialectic a little bit. So
it doesn't.
I can wait.
Go for it. Go for it.
All right. Well, in E.J. Erwick's The Platonic Quest, which was published by Concord Grove Press years ago, I think should be a very influential book. He discusses how Plato considers himself the ninth teacher in the line from Pythagoras, who was called the Yavana Guru in India, the Western teacher. And Erwick shows, I think, without a doubt, that there's a very strong connection between Indian philosophy and Greek philosophy. It may be that even the stranger in one of the dialogues of Plato, I think it's Statesman, I would have to review, might even be a man from India to whom Socrates talks. And so I think we need to consider in the Platonic Quest that there were many of these ideas that came through mystery schools, like Socrates, when he's dying in the Phaedo, mentions the Orphic mysteries, the Eleusinian mysteries, which Jim was alluding to in the myth of Ur. And it seems that we need to consider that, for example, the chariot analogy in the Upanishads is very much like the one in the Phaedrus. And so I think theosophically, the connection between Pythagoras, Plato, and India is very important to consider. And I think we need to examine that, because this is a universal philosophy. This isn't just confined to ancient Greece or 2,500 years ago or any of those things. So I wonder if we could address that idea at some point.
Thank you very much for the question. I'll try to recapture the question just a little bit, and you can tune it in a little bit if you want to. But basically, this connection, A, between Plato and Pythagoras, and B, between both of them, and the wisdom of the East. And that a lot of the analogies, stories, teachings, there's a through line. And it so it's not just that Western philosophy is footnotes to Plato, but Plato himself is footnotes from the sages of the East, you could say. And this goes into the idea that many of these philosophers, many of these scientists, many of these saviors that different religions talk about, they are initiates, and they are either members of the elder brothers, so to speak, elder brothers and sisters of humanity, or they are messengers of them, or both somehow. And theosophically, Buddha was such a being, Jesus was such a being, Lao Tzu, etc. Plato, Pythagoras, Tsongkhapa, right, from Tibet. All these mysterious beings, Zoroaster. So the theosophy, you could say, is like the primeval revelation of the inheritance of all of humanity. So there's not just only a through line, but there's a reason for it. Is that all these beings were all initiates, and they knew an extremely high ratio compared to what they said. They were fundamentally resident beings, and even though our minds are blown by what they say, they knew infinitely more than what they said. And that's probably an explanation for why there's a difference, because there's different emphasis depending on the therapy and the therapeutics of what they were delivering and with their teachings. Does anyone else have a comment on that question? And anybody who wants to just raise your hand, but if you don't mind to turn your camera on. You don't have to, but it makes for a nice video if you do.
I think Judy's point is well taken, because there is usually people make a distinction between the early Socratic dialogues and then the middle and later dialogues, when Plato was most definitely into the stream of Pythagorean thought, and in fact traveled to Syracuse and had done various things. But in Pythagoras, we get the notion of not only immortality, but also of transmigration, and therefore reincarnation, and therefore the reference by Judy to the fact that he's also recognized in India. So you see the coming together of East and West in Pythagoras, because he also has a cosmic teaching as well, which Socrates did not have. So you have a cosmic perspective. You have the notion of the soul seeking to reunite itself with the one, which is the good in Plato. You have the notion of a community of people, just as you have the republic as a community in which justice is to be actualized. And also the nature of the relationships between people. Then you have the philosopher king, because philosophy is so important in Pythagoras. So there are a number of elements and also Pythagoras is the first one really to talk in the Western thought in terms of men and women being of equal status from a spiritual point of view, even though their roles might be different, but they're of an equal status. Plato, in his turn in the Republic, says the only difference between male and female is the male is more physically capable of certain things that a woman cannot do, but she can participate in everything else. You can have a philosopher queen. It doesn't have to be a philosopher king. So there are all these elements that come in Platonic thought that are definitely seem to be an echo of Pythagoras, and he in turn, in addition to Egypt, was influenced by India. So one can see that, and as Jonathan, as you're saying, these great beings, they managed to bring together different streams and mix them in unusually magnificent ways that are appropriate for a particular point in time. And Plato's model, and he shows you what's so interesting, he shows you not only an ideal republic, because there were many utopians later on, centuries later, who given a utopian vision, but he shows you how it can be corrupted. He shows you how it goes through different stages. And you could probably look at current America and see mobocracy in there very clearly in terms of the mongrel kind of culture we've created out of a lost sense of the democratic republic, of a republic. Anyway, those are some thoughts on that.
Robert's got his hand up, and we'll get to Monica. Or did you have something directly off of what Jim was saying?
It can certainly wait. Let's hear it.
Okay, Robert.
Yes, if you take a consideration of the prisoners in the cave, in the allegory of the cave,
yeah,
which is ourselves.
Yeah.
What is it that stimulates the prisoner to get out of his chains?
Okay, that's a question for everybody.
Yeah.
Anybody have any idea? I thought it was that the prisoner was unshackled by somebody. Am I wrong? But on the end, Wes, do you have a? Could you unmute yourself? You're still muted somehow.
Yeah, there we go. Third time. Can you hear me?
Yeah, wonderfully.
Sorry. Okay. I think in the Republic, Plato just doesn't say how that individual develops. But we would have, theosophically, we would probably say somehow through his own self-induced and self-advised efforts, he managed to get free enough of his shackles to attempt to leave the cave. Now, whether he got help along the way, we just don't know. Plato gives it's only a few pages in the Republic, much long text. Like he lets us work that one out for ourselves. How can we get free? So, and by the way, very, very good rendering of the myth of I've read the Republic many times, and it's a very, very good telling of that end of the book. So shared very well. Thank you.
Yeah, that was really I forgot that one element, of course, are the people that go back in the cave and try and tell people, this is an illusion. You're prisoners. So
yeah, they get all upset because he can't see when he comes back. It's dark. He's gotten used to the light, and now he can't see. And so they say, well, you're more ignorant than we are because at least we know what's going on down here.
Yeah. Two blindnesses. When you get out of the cave, you can't see because it's too bright. And when you go from the brightness to the darkness, you can't see because you haven't adjusted.
Well, the mysterious thing here is, though, in the Republic, in the allegory of the cave, the prisoners are completely captivated. Someone comes down from the other world and unshackles someone and forces them to stand up and turns them around and almost has to drag them up the cave to a point because the person is so shocked by the differences between what they've been seeing, which is shadows, and beginning to slowly realize that there are different levels of things, so to speak, and that he's being taken something to a whole different way of looking at things. So there's a sense in which the guide that does this is like necessity. It's like necessity at some point, waking someone up and forcing that person to face the possibility that the world they see is not the real world, and there is a future world. But I like what was just being said by Wes and Robert. But the interesting thing is, it's painful. But when they get up and discover this deeper world of archetypes, and then they have to make a decision, this is where Plato is so magnificent, because he said, you can stay there, moksha, or you can return into the cave. Now, what is really wonderful about this, we say good, good, good. No, it's the person who returns is taking a real risk. It is not risk-free. There's no guarantees. This person going back into the cave and sitting back down with people and pretending to see what they see, and yet trying to find a way to educate them and draw them up to where they can turn around and make their own effort to get out with his guidance. That's not easy. And you can fall back asleep. You can get distracted. There are a number of things that can happen. You can also get killed, said Plato. Most people who come in with this kind of message end up being, martyred. So it's interesting how he wants to point out, whenever we try to do good in a place where it's really challenging to do good, do it with your eyes open. And don't be naive. And be willing to suffer for it quietly, silently. But always be aware and remember where you came from. Remember your ideal and don't forget it. And be detached. You don't know what will happen.
Ruth Collins? You might have to unmute yourself, Truth.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, when I saw the four-fold division, it reminded me of the four elements explained by Kuhn, Alvin Boyd Kuhn, as corresponding to earth, water, air, fire. And it reminded me, I was wondering, do you think that there's a correspondence between these elements and their association, earth with senses, water with emotion, air with mind, and fire with spirit? And also of Buddhism, there's Maya, the senses are like Maya in a way, insofar as we interpret them, and our interpretations can be wrong.
These are good questions. You could certainly make the argument for what you said. Let me see if I can at least repeat it. You're saying that the earth would be the senses, water would be like the emotions, and air would be like the intellect. Is that true? And then fire
Yes.
would be like the sun, like, and so forth. You could probably make other arguments, about why different elements are different things. But you could definitely make the argument for what you just said. Maybe you could say what you could take with water. You could say, the water's a space, like the akasha and so forth. So you could do different things, fire could be like the passions and the emotions, So, but there's definitely, I think there's some utility in the way you're saying that. And like you're pointing out with like Buddhism and different forms of Hinduism, they all have this teaching of Maya that, and that's even one of the, you could call it the 6 items of cosmogony in the secret doctrine. All is Maya. And I think it's like the 4th one. So it's just like a fundamental approach to looking at the universe is that you have to take into account Maya. So, and that's part of the part of the Platonic quest, wouldn't we think? That how do you navigate that? And how do you turn around? Isn't there a Greek word for turning around? Metanoia, I think it's called, where there's that thing. It's a fundamental shift in directionality. And this thing about there must be, one would think, something, even though we're shackled in the cave, that's a fact. There must be something within us that is, even though it's incredibly latent, that it is sun-like, or else we wouldn't recognize it. That at some latent level partakes of the nature of light and true perspective and of reality. And as was mentioned, once a person can begin to make contact with the flickerings of awakening, then there's that painful process of turning around, and then the self-induced and self-devised efforts of getting up and out and becoming free. So really this whole myth has to do with, or this analogy has to do with Maya and freedom, and as was mentioned by Jim, sacrifice for those who would choose to re-enter the cave. Monica.
Yes, and I'll start out by saying, please forgive my ignorance in the sense that I have a mix up in my head about time frames. But I was wondering regarding call and response, the dialectic, this system of bringing forth enlightenment and the debate structure that happens at university. And I'm remembering particularly Tsongkhapa use the structure of debating to purify the mind and perhaps give the students, bring them closer to an experience that all is Maya. And so I wondered, who's influencing who? Which is influencing which? But they seem to be a root of one another. I'm just slightly confused about where, when, that kind of thing.
The dialectic in relation to debate?
Yes, and the structure that Plato uses in the dialectic, using Socrates.
Yeah. I would say, and I want others to think about that question, but I would say that there's something built into this dialectic that's part of the breathing of the universe. It is fundamentally rooted in abstract motion, you could say, the great breath.
Yes.
And there's the breathing of the soul. There's incarnation, there's participation, there's learning, there's a gathering of experiences, there's assimilation, and then there's the return, right?
Got it.
And that whole the cyclic evolution part of it, which is another manifestation of just the natural ebb and flow of life.
Yes.
In cyclicity. But there's also, you can look at this divided line, the dialectic and so forth, as being a vertical process. The first diagram showed it horizontal. You can separate them like this, right? But there's also a way that some are more refined than others, more subtle, you could say. And that's part of the breathing of the universe too. You know, they're going out and then they're coming back home, you could say. So, so this call and response somehow, like movements and music and so forth, and this with the refrain in music and so forth, or the refrain in poetry, you know, like in Shelley and so forth. It's returning to a theme, like you
Yes.
see in Shakespeare,
Mhm.
but at a different level and a different level of unfoldment and so forth. But that is part of this fundamental dialectic, and you could just call it life. It's life. And now this thing about debate, that's a very ancient tradition, right? You've got, like you say, Tsongkhapa, and it goes, and all the Tibetan stuff goes back to the Buddhist teachings and teachers of Nalanda in India, northern India, because Tibet has been kind of going for about 1,000 years, as I understand it. But the previous 1,000 years before that, you had all of the 17 teachers that the Dalai Lama celebrates. You know, Chandrakirti, Shantideva, Nagarjuna. He is the master dialectician.
Yes, Nagarjuna.
Nagarjuna.
Yes.
But the thing about debate, to me, that has huge relevance, because the idea that two people can actually be in a room together and can hold a thought, make an argument, try not to make it too personal, but to respect the other position long enough to plumb what they're saying and how they got to their conclusions. Tell me where I'm wrong. I want to learn something about myself. You've been thinking about this a long time. What have you got? Okay, right? Yeah. And then vice versa. That kind of deep respect. With that, our society could pull that off, right? So, does anyone have any other? Ken.
I have a question. You know, as we talk about moving up that that vertical pathway from the fantasy and the opinions to higher mind, how does the analogy of from the cave story of the man, as Jim was saying, going back into the dangerous territory of going back into the cave to show others, how does that relate to the jewels of the demon Mara, who's trying to tempt us to stay back? Because it may be like the story of the despot who was the first to choose, and when Jim was telling you the myth of or maybe like say the modern physical scientist who wants to get the Nobel Prize, who wants to get a jewel of Mara, and gets hooked into something that's not as bad as the despot, but still it's just as myopically bad as the temptations of Mara. Is that reasonable to think that way?
That makes a lot of sense. Jim, do you have anything on that question?
Is this the question about Maya?
Mara.
The demon Mara, who is tempting us to come back.
Well, yeah, that's Plato tries to show in the dialectic as one understands it. That's a big qualification. But when you presented the dialectic vertically from parapolitics, it shows you there are progressive degrees of knowledge that one can grow into by effort and by consulting the wise, learning from experience. One can progressively realize degrees of the good, even at the lowest level. To get back to the question before, a little earlier, about Maya, even the person, says Plato, whose only conception of the good is what is good for me, still there's a germ of the good, the transcendent good, the agathon, in him. But his sense of self is so constricted that it's very hard for him to see anything other than an image, or be captivated and hypnotized. There you have Mara in the form of good for you, and what seems pleasant, what seems pleasing, and what seems in his or her interest. They mislead and deceive. But when he learns or she learns through suffering and pain that no, it's not just what's good for me, there are also others who have been helpful and I've depended on. I've now turned to people for help, and I'm becoming aware of them as individuals too. They're not just objects in my world. They're beings who suffer and beings who have knowledge. And so he begins to move up to the second level of the dialectic, where he then embraces at some point right belief. He embraces beliefs as being important, guides to action, not just what he thinks is his own interest. And rules always integrate with the community. And anyway, the point is, the good is present at every point, but so is Maya. Until you get to the apex and can mystically merge into the agathon, where you're in what the Jains call infinite mind, where you behold things as they are, because there's no separation between you as a knower of the act of knowing and that which is known. And that's ineffable and that's incommunicable. But it's reflected at every single level of even a person who's self-absorbed can have moments of expansion.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what's so beautiful about Theosophia, and what Plato articulates of that force is that every human being has the potential, through exercise of thought, that which expands the circumference of self is when it entertains ideas that are transpersonal, that are universal, as we say, that are all human, pan-human. We begin to awaken in us that faculty that can perceive at any level what is true and relevant and good.
Thank you, Jim.
Yeah, that's I think our time is up, and that's a really good way to end the meeting. I think so. Thank you all very much for your contributions and for being here on this universal quest that we're all on, the Platonic Quest, as is suggested. So thank you all very much. And
next week is transmutation of desire.
Wow, and that pertains to what we were talking about.
Yes.
So very good.
Lizette,
Funny how that happens.
Awesome.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you, Wesley. Thank you all for coming.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye. Namaste.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you, John.